these violent midwives of Europe are almost always now today known as Arabs, Saracens, Moors, Turks, Ottomans, Tatars. They're always given a national name, but the reality is, if you dig into the sources, they saw themselves first and foremost as Muslims. And what they were doing was fulfilling the Islamic mandate via jihad. That's what comes out in their sources. But like I said, if you look into it, every time the rationale of these various groups, whoever they may be, is the ISIS rationale, the Islamic State rationale, the one that you've been told has nothing to do with Islam.
A historical perspective from the great historian, Mr. Raymond Ibrahim. The way he explains the history of Islamism, of Muslim, and the way we relate to it today.
Here's now another good quote from Bernard Lewis, well-known historian, deceased now, of course. He writes, quote, "We tend nowadays to forget that for approximately 1,000 years from the advent of Islam in the 7th century until the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, which I just mentioned, Christian Europe was under constant threat from Islam, the double threat of conquest and conversion. Most of the new domains were wrested from Christendom. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa were all Christian countries, no less, indeed, rather more, than Europe. All this left a deep sense of loss and a deep terror." Okay, very accurate. It's very hard nowadays to come across such frankness in historical books that deal with this topic, except mine, of course. It's also worth mentioning that in the modern histories that people write, and I might try to get into the sort of semantic games that historians play to sort of whitewash all this, but these violent midwives of Europe are almost always now today known as Arabs, Saracens, Moors, Turks, Ottomans, Tatars. They're always given a national name, okay? But the reality is, if you dig into the sources, they saw themselves first and foremost as Muslims. And what they were doing was fulfilling the Islamic mandate via jihad. That's what comes out in their sources. So in other words, this wasn't just one of the games that historians try to play. Is like, okay, it's one national group attacking another, Turks attacking Greeks, okay, no big deal. But like I said, if you look into it, every time the rationale of these various groups, whoever they may be, is the ISIS rationale, the Islamic State rationale, the one that you've been told has nothing to do with Islam. That was the rationale for 14 centuries worth of jihad that completely terrorized much of the world, especially the Christian world. So one of the topics, for example, is slavery. I mentioned this, I think, to someone the other day, but here in America or in the West, you mentioned the word slavery. It means whites enslaving blacks. That's it. And it's kind of like amazing, because the reality is, yeah, that did happen. And this is one of the problems. It's not that these historians or the fake histories that I'm discussing are lying. They always present things in a vacuum without telling you. So of course, in reality, everyone enslaved everyone. And Muslims especially enslaved a lot of Europeans. Based on a tally I did a while back, 14 million Europeans were enslaved by Muslims from as far as Iceland, from Iceland to Russia, okay? And this is mostly from the very beginning, from those centuries that I was mentioning in the 7th and 8th, but especially in the 15th and 16th century. In the 17th century, you may have heard of the Barbary pirates in North Africa. They subsisted entirely on enslaving Europeans. And I think in just a few decades in the 16th century, there was as many as 1.25 million European slaves in the markets of Algiers. But we don't hear about that, do we? So speaking of Barbary and trying to really cap off this whole long, epic jihad that went on century after century, few people know that no one was spared, not even America. America's very first war as a nation after independence was with Muslims who were acting on the very same impetus that I'm describing to you right now. And I'm talking, of course, of the Barbary Wars. And so basically what happened is these North African Muslim vessels started attacking American vessels in the Atlantic and enslaving their soldiers and really mistreating them. You can see it in the sources. And what's interesting is Thomas Jefferson and I think John Adams met with one of the ambassadors from Barbary. And Jefferson then wrote a letter back to Congress. They met the ambassador to try to parlay and get get the American sailors back. So Jefferson wrote the following in a letter from 1786 to Congress, quote, "We took the liberty to make some inquiries concerning the grounds of the Barbary pirates, pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury, such as America, and observed that we, Americans, considered all mankind as our friends, who had done us no wrong, nor had given us any provocation. The ambassador from Barbary answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." You can only imagine what this enlightened thinker was thinking when he was told all this. But as you can see, I give you that quote because that is the rationale and the logic that Muslims had used in all those centuries before that I was discussing. From the 7th century, here we come up until 1800, 19th century. And it's the same logic. And it's the logic that we've been forever told has nothing to do with Islam and is just a representation of a handful of radicals, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is, this was so well known, what I'm describing right now, which again, maybe not so much to you, but to most people in this country is just bizarre and they've never heard of it. This was so well known up until recently. So consider this quote from none other than Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, who was no mean historian himself. In his book, his 1916 book, Fear God and Take Your Part, he wrote the following: "Christianity was saved in Europe solely because the peoples of Europe fought. If the peoples of Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries, and on up to and including the 17th century, had not possessed a military equality with, and gradually a growing superiority over the Mohammedans who invaded Europe, Europe would at this moment be Mohammedan, and the Christian religion would be exterminated. Wherever the Mohammedans have had complete sway, wherever the Christians have been unable to resist them by the sword, Christianity has ultimately disappeared. From the hammer of Charles Martel to the sword of Sobieski, Christianity owed its safety in Europe to the fact that it was able to show that it could and would fight as well as the Mohammedan aggressor." That's an American president that said that. Sorry, if you can imagine that. So let's fast forward to our dismal times and discuss a little bit of what I like to call fake history. You're all familiar with fake news, of course. Fake history, in my opinion, is much more dangerous because fake news is ephemeral. It does its mischief and then it's gone. Fake history props up and creates false paradigms of the past through which people sift modern day events through. And so it essentially poisons much of everything. Perfect example is the idea that the only people who ever enslaved anyone are white people, which a lot of people believe. I was watching one Rutgers professor, her name is Brittany Cooper, black woman. And that's basically what she said. She basically made it sound that the only ones who have ever enslaved anyone were white people. Everyone else got along historically when they landed on each other's shores, okay? And then she culminates it with, I guess just, white people are so committed to being villains, okay? And that's literally her words. Now you can understand why she thinks that because she's following a fake history. So that's the danger of all these fake histories. But in the fake history of the current topic, I'll give you one perfect quote from a professor. I don't know if you've ever heard of John Esposito, and he's a professor at Georgetown University, and he was actually there when I was there at the time, and he was a don. Whatever he said about Islam, he was the go-to guy. He's the author of more than 35 books. He was the editor-in-chief of numerous Oxford reference works, including Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World and the Oxford History of Islam. He was an advisor on many movies about Islam and documentaries, and perhaps most notably, he was the go-to expert, like I said, on Islam. He was constantly called on to brief the State Department, FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, et cetera. This is from his bio, by the way. So he writes, now keep in mind what I've told you about the history, the constant nonstop bombardment that began in the 7th century. He writes, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians elapsed before political events and an imperial papal power play led to centuries-long series of so-called holy wars that pitted Christendom against Islam and left an enduring legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. That's from his book, Islam, the Straight Path. What he's saying is that before the First Crusade, which was called for in 1095, from the birth of Islam, it's not even 5 centuries, but it's about 473 years from Muhammad's time until the First Crusade, those 5 centuries roughly were defined by peaceful coexistence. When 3/4 of Christendom was conquered and swallowed up, that was the peaceful coexistence times that got ruined by the First Crusade. These are the sorts of lies that are just being peddled. And like I gave you a little bit of his credentials and how sought after this guy is. And this is the stuff that he writes and that people read and that people believe. Which brings us to the Crusades, of course, which ironically to me, as important as they were really a drop in the bucket of the totality of warfare between Christians and Muslims. But they're the ones that you heard of because they make Christians look bad. Because in the Crusades, you have Christians moving from their homeland into what's perceived as Muslim territory. So they're the aggressors, so we can talk about that. But if you look at all the wars, I describe them a lot in my book, Sword and Scimitar, again, that's just a drop in the bucket because most of the attacks and the assaults were from the Muslims on Christian lands. And even the Crusades were actually part of just war. Recall that all those territories I told you about, including the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and Egypt, were Christian before Muslims took it. The first Crusaders were aware of this. So when they were going there, in their mind, they were liberating ancient Christian territories and bringing them back under Christian rule, which again fits into just war theory.
The history of Islam and its relations with Christians and, of course, the Jewish people. Throughout history, there has been many shifts of the plates of history that, of course, during the Inquisition, during the Crusaders, where Christianity was the dominant religion, and both Islam and Judaism were paying the price for that. There were times that the Jews and the Muslims had fear of the same enemy, which was at that time the Crusaders, the Inquisitioners. And then the plates of history totally shifted itself. The Judeo-Christian alliance has arisen. As Christianity went through its own transformation and was able to rebrand itself and realize that killing Jews is ungodly, that killing Jews is pure hatred, baseless hatred. And although that has gone on for 2,000 years, but it came to a screeching halt, a screeching end. When Christianity has been able to move from the first century, to move from 2,000 years ago, all the ways to where we are today. Christianity and Judaism are together trying to survive against the onslaught of the Muslims. And if we talk about numbers, the Jewish people, we are just 15 million. That's it, 15 million in population in the world. We are just about where we were prior to the Holocaust, when we lost 6 million. Imagine, from 15 million, we lost 6 million. Versus 2 billion Muslims, 2 billion Christians, 15 million Jews. We are the smallest of all religions. And yet this has been foretold to us in the Bible. When God gave the 10 Commandments to the Israelites, and he introduced them to Judaism, and God said very clear that you will always be the smallest amongst them. However, if you follow my direction, and if you join in the partnership to be my ambassador, to be God's ambassadors to the world, to be a light unto the nations, to teach the world these laws, these codes, these ethics that we teach in the Torah, teach it to the world, transform the world, create this world to be a dwelling place for spirituality. And that is and was the journey of Judaism. It was all about the fundamentals. The founding fathers of Judaism was built on kindness. The very first Jew, known as Ibrahim, and his wife Sarah, they built their religion based on kindness, on compassion, on benefiting the other person, regardless of race, color, or religion. That is the foundation of Judaism. As we read in the Bible that Sarah and Abraham together, the very first act as religious people, they pitched a tent in a scorching hot desert and welcomed travelers from all four corners of the earth to come in. They had 4 openings to their tent so that everyone could come from the north, from the south, from the east, and the west. And they would feed them, give them shelter, give them provisions. And when they would thank them, they'd say, "Don't thank me, thank God." So God, they never heard of God. There's never ever mention of a God in heaven. They were all idol worshippers. And Abraham and Sarah will introduce them to the God, the omnipotent, the omnipresent, the God who created. There's only one God in the world, one God that we believe in. That's where monotheism was introduced. And that is the bedrock of Judaism. It's kindness, it's benevolence, it's compassion, sensitivity, and doing everything you can to save another person's life. Judaism values life more than anything else. It's obsessed with the life and the living. This is why, till this very day, Israel is on the forefront in the medical world, because it understands the value of not only saving a person's life, but giving God's children comfort and health. This is why we are at the forefront in all areas of humanity to help humanity. That's what Judaism is about. And Judaism is the mother of all religions. All religions came after Judaism. Where Islam came about in the 7th century, that the foundation, the cornerstone, was all about death, carnage, darkness. And we're suffering from that till today. And many say it's just a fraction of Islam, of Muslims that are radicalized, that believe that they have to kill the world to join the caliphate. But when you talk about 2 billion people and only a fraction of them, let's say 1 or 2% are radicalized, you're talking about millions. And what we're facing right now in the world is the terrorism, the fear that has been brought upon in the last 7 decades by the globalized intifada, by sponsored terrorism to the Houthis, to the Hezbollah, to Hamas, that all comes out of Iran, is very daunting and very frightening. The history of Muslim is like the history of any other religion, as Dr. Raymond, the historian, just shared it with us, for us to understand and appreciate where they came from, but to also realize that not all Muslims are bad, not all Christians are bad, not all Jews are bad. No one is bad. It's based on how you act. If the end result is death, carnage, suffering, suicide bombers, planes into buildings, bombing, RPGs, terror, then that is how you are describing yourself. God created us on this world to live and to promote life. Judaism and Israel are obsessed with life. And I've been told that a Hamas official said once, as much as Israel is obsessed with life, they are obsessed with death. And that's what we're dealing with. Their theology is not about this world. It's about all the promises of what they're going to get in the next world. And this world is almost no point for them. So they have no compunction of just killing randomly, because this world is nothing. I mean, we have seen the images of mothers taking babies and offering them to be the forefront suicide bombers. I mean, it's just insane. We cannot put our mind around it. How could parents give birth to a child and can't wait for them to blow themselves up and kill as many people as possible with them? So that's the society we're dealing with. It all comes down to this. God has gifted us to have survived to bring the world to the 21st century. We have moved forward. They are stuck in the 7th century. And we have to be able to make them understand that it's time to move forward. It's time to let go death by the sword if we don't accept their religion. We can all coexist with our own religions, and we should all support each other for our own religions, as long as the religions is about life, not about death. So now that we have a little more of an understanding of what we're dealing with, perhaps we can have a more of an insight of the war that we are fighting now, of where the axis of evil is out, and how we all have to pray to God stronger and stronger to help topple this Iranian regime that's there right now, that is swearing to the annihilation of Israel, the Jewish people, and the West and America. Let's take them seriously, and let's not wait for that to happen. Been there, done that prior to World War II. We cannot allow this to repeat itself. As we say, never again is today. God bless you. God loves you.